In the world of private investigation, we are trained to look for logic. We look for footprints, DNA, and motives. But what happens when the evidence defies the laws of physics? What happens when a house doesn't just hold memories, but actively tries to break the people living inside it? Tonight, we are heading to Lamar, Arkansas. This isn't a campfire tale or a local legend whispered by teenagers. This is a documented case of a family that walked into a dream home and barely escaped a living nightmare. Before we begin, a warning. The following account contains descriptions of a traumatic accident and unsettling paranormal events. Viewer discretion is advised. In 2003, Jaime and Ben Shea thought they had hit the jackpot. A sprawling historic estate for a price that seemed too good to be true. But as any investigator will tell you, when the price is low, the cost is usually hidden elsewhere. Behind the beautiful facade of this 18th century home lay a chilling discovery. Behind a boarded-up fireplace in an upstairs bedroom, spray-painted in jagged lines, was a pentagram, and beneath it, a name. Seth. The local records were clean. No crimes were reported here in decades. But the house itself began to speak. It started with the sound of a rubber ball bouncing down the wooden stairs when no one was there. It escalated to voices, hundreds of them, overlapping in a frantic, unintelligible sea of sound in their young son's bedroom. Then came the physical toll. This is where the line between the supernatural and the psychological blurs. The Shays weren't just scared, they were being hunted by exhaustion. And on a quiet afternoon in Arkansas, that exhaustion turned into a mangled wreck of steel and glass on a rural highway. A mother, a daughter, and a split second that almost ended everything. But the most terrifying piece of evidence didn't come from a police report or a hospital file. It came from a CD player. Long after the house was empty, a disc skipped to a track that shouldn't have existed. Track 99. A voice that wasn't human, begging for something that no one living could provide. I am your investigator, and this is Horror Stories. Put on your headphones, turn down the lights, and let's look at the facts of what really happened in the house where Seth never lived. Lamar, Arkansas. It is a small, quiet town tucked away in the Arkansas River Valley. In 2003, this was the place where Jaime and Ben Shea decided to plant their roots. They weren't looking for trouble, they were looking for space. With 3 children, Tori, Bridger, and baby Jackson, their current home was becoming a tight fit. They wanted a porch where they could sit in the evenings, a yard big enough for the kids to run, and a piece of history they could call their own. When Jaime's aunt mentioned a colonial-style house that wasn't even on the market yet, it felt like fate. This wasn't just any house. Built partially in the late 1700s, with additions from 1811, it was one of the oldest private residences in the entire state. It was beautiful. Massive oak trees shaded the property, and a grand front porch wrapped around the structure. To Jaime, a lover of history and architecture, it was perfect. And the price? It was shockingly low, lower than anything else in the area. In the world of real estate, we call that a red flag. But to a growing family on a budget, it looked like a blessing. The Shays did their walkthrough, charmed by the 4 original fireplaces and the hand-etched dates in the stone. But as they climbed the stairs to the upper floor, the atmosphere began to shift. They reached the final bedroom, a room that would eventually belong to 5-year-old Bridger. The charm of the house ended at that doorway. Inside the room, the fireplace had been boarded up with heavy plywood. It wasn't just sealed, it was defaced. Someone had taken a can of black spray paint and drawn a large, jagged pentagram across the boards. Scattered on the floor were the stubs of burnt candles, the remnants of wax dripping onto the old wood. It looked like a scene from a low-budget horror film, a ritual or a seance held by trespassers while the house sat vacant. But it was the writing that truly chilled the air. Beneath the occult symbol, a name was written in bold, permanent strokes. Seth. Ben and Jaime shared a look. It was unsettling, yes, but they were practical people. They told themselves it was just kids being kids. Just some local teenagers breaking into an empty house to act tough and play with things they didn't understand. They decided they wouldn't let a bit of graffiti ruin their dream. They bought the house. They moved in. They scrubbed the floors and prepared to paint over the darkness. However, the history of this land was deeper than a coat of paint could cover. Just 100 yards behind the back fence sat an old Confederate cemetery. Dozens of weathered, gray headstones marked the final resting places of soldiers from the 1800s. A narrow, dirt driveway led from the house directly to the graveyard, a silent, stony audience watching the Sheas move their furniture in. As they settled, the house began to reveal its true nature. It didn't happen all at once. It started with a heavy feeling, a sense that the air in the hallways was thicker than it should be. Jamie, who had experienced strange things in her youth, felt a familiar prickle on the back of her neck. Ben, a rational man working as a nurse, tried to focus on the renovations. But even a nurse's logic couldn't explain the visitors who started appearing. Not long after moving in, Jamie held a yard sale to clear out some clutter. A woman from the neighborhood approached the porch. But she didn't come to buy anything. She stood at the railing, her eyes scanning the windows of the upper floor. She looked at Jamie and said, "There are a lot of spirits in this house. I can feel the energy. It's heavy." Jamie tried to laugh it off. But the woman wasn't joking. A few weeks later, another encounter occurred at the local grocery store. A woman working as a greeter recognized Jamie. She said, "You live in that old house in Lamar, don't you? My family used to own that place. I grew up there." Then, her voice dropped. "It's haunted. We all knew it." She told Jamie a story that had been passed down through her family for generations. In the 1800s, a young boy had been playing near an upstairs window, the very same window in the room with the pentagram. He had lost his balance and fallen to his death on the hard ground below. Suddenly, the name, Seth, under the pentagram didn't feel like a prank anymore. It felt like a warning. The Sheas had moved into a sanctuary, but they were beginning to realize they were actually guests in someone else's territory. The boarded-up fireplace wasn't just a wall, it was a seal. And by moving into that room, they had unknowingly invited whatever was behind those boards to come out and play. The honeymoon phase of their new home was over. The silence of the Arkansas countryside was about to be replaced by sounds that no living person should hear. The dream was fading, and the first shadows were beginning to stretch across the floor of Bridger's room. The transition from a quiet house to a haunted one is rarely explosive. It begins in the margins. It starts with a sound you think you misheard, or a shadow you assume was just a trick of the light. For the Shea family, the honeymoon phase of their historic Arkansas home ended exactly 2 months after they unpacked the last box. The atmosphere didn't just change, it soured. As a private investigator, I look for patterns. In this case, the pattern began with Ben Shea. Because Ben worked nights as a nurse and attended theater classes during the day, his sleep schedule was fragmented. To ensure he could rest, the couple hired a family friend, Desta, to watch 8-month-old Jackson during the mornings. Ben would sleep in the master bedroom downstairs while Desta and the baby stayed in the common areas or went for walks. One morning, Ben was jolted awake by a sound that every parent knows by heart, the rhythmic, distressed wail of a hungry infant. The sound was coming through the baby monitor sitting on his nightstand. He waited, expecting to hear Desta's footsteps or the sound of her picking the baby up. But the crying continued. It grew louder, sharper, more desperate. Frustrated and concerned, Ben finally threw off the covers and headed upstairs to the nursery. He expected to find a distracted sitter or a crying child. Instead, he found a room that was perfectly, unnaturally silent. The crib was empty. The nursery was vacant. When he went downstairs, he found Desta just returning from a walk outside. The baby had been with her the entire time, nearly 100 yards away from the house. There was no physical way for Jackson's voice to have reached that monitor. Ben was left standing in a silent hallway, holding a device that had just broadcast the screams of a child who wasn't there. This wasn't an isolated technical glitch. The house was beginning to manifest a personality, one that was observant and predatory. Next, it targeted 5-year-old Bridger. Bridger had always been a good sleeper. But suddenly, he refused to go to his room. He would cling to Jamie, begging to sleep on the floor of the master bedroom. When they finally sat him down to ask what was wrong, his answer wasn't the typical monster under the bed. "I can't sleep because of the talking," he said. Jaime asked if he was hearing his sister Tori on the phone or the TV downstairs. Bridger shook his head. "No, it sounds like a lot of people. Everyone is talking at the same time. But I can't understand what they are saying." Imagine that for a moment. A 5-year-old boy, lying in the dark, surrounded by the invisible murmur of a crowd. It wasn't a whisper, it was a cacophony. It was the sound of a sea of people, occupying a space that was supposed to be empty. As an investigator, this detail is crucial. It suggests that the house wasn't just haunted by one spirit, but perhaps served as a corridor or a gathering point for many. Then, the physical activity escalated. It moved from the auditory to the mechanical. Jaime and Ben began to hear the pounding. It wasn't the rhythmic settling of an old house or the scratching of rodents in the walls. It was deliberate. It sounded like a heavy, closed fist striking the wall right above their headboards. It would start with one loud bang, then two, then three. Each time they investigated, they found nothing. No loose pipes, no shifted foundation, just solid wood and cold air. But the most cinematic and chilling manifestation was the ball. Multiple times, while the family was downstairs watching television, they would hear a distinct sound from the second floor. Thud, thud, thud. It was the sound of a rubber ball, dropped from the top of the stairs, bouncing down every single wooden step until it reached the bottom. Every time they rushed to the hallway, the stairs were empty. No ball was found. To a skeptic, these are just noises. But to the person living inside those walls, it is a form of psychological warfare. The shadowy figure in the window that neighbors began to report wasn't just a rumor, it was a consistent sighting. People driving by the Shea residence began to notice a dark outline standing in the upstairs window, the same window from which a child had allegedly fallen a century prior. The house was no longer a sanctuary, it was a pressure cooker. The lights in the hallway leading to the Pentagram Room refused to stay on. Electricians were called, wires were checked, and bulbs were replaced, but within an hour, the hallway would return to darkness. Even battery-operated touch lamps, placed there to comfort a terrified Bridger, would have their brand new batteries drained in less than 60 minutes. The entity, or entities, within the home were feeding. They were drawing energy from the electrical system, from the history of the land, and most importantly, from the fear of the family. The Shays were becoming irritable, exhausted, and hyper-vigilant. They were living in a state of constant physiological stress, a detail that many investigators believe created the perfect environment for the tragedy that was about to strike on the highway. The signs were all there. The warnings had been given by the neighbors, by the greeter at the store, and by the house itself. But the Shays were trapped by their investment and their hope that things would just get better. They didn't realize that in this house, silence was a luxury they could no longer afford. The first signs were over. The house was done playing games, and it was ready to move from sounds to actions. In the world of criminal investigation, we often talk about the breaking point. It is that specific moment when a system, a structure, or a human being can no longer withstand the pressure being applied to it. By late 2003, the Shea family was vibrating at that breaking point. The house in Lamar had transitioned from a curiosity to a source of chronic, debilitating stress. But the most dangerous element wasn't a ghost, it was the biological reality of sleep deprivation and the erosion of the mind. As an investigator, I have to look at the facts. Jaime and Ben were not just dealing with strange noises, they were losing their ability to function. Ben was working night shifts as a nurse, a job that requires absolute precision and mental clarity, while trying to sleep in a house that broadcast phantom infant cries through his monitor. Jaime was managing 3 children while living in a state of hypervigilance. Her ears constantly tuned for the next bang on the wall or the sound of a rubber ball on the stairs. This is what we call physiological siege. When you don't feel safe in your own home, your body never leaves the fight or flight mode. Your cortisol levels spike, your reaction times slow down, and your judgment becomes clouded. The haunting had reached a fever pitch. In the weeks leading up to the tragedy, The activity was no longer confined to the night. Jaime reported seeing shadows out of the corner of her eye during the day. A dark, humanoid outline was frequently seen standing in the upstairs window, the very room where Bridger heard the sea of people talking over one another. The atmosphere was so heavy it felt like walking through water. It was under this cloud of exhaustion and unseen pressure that Jaime got behind the wheel of the family's minivan on a day that should have been routine. It was a school day. Jaime had picked up Tori, Bridger, and baby Jackson. They were only 3 miles from home, a distance most of us drive without a second thought. But the road was under construction. Bright orange barrels lined the lane, and the air was thick with the heat of an Arkansas afternoon. According to official reports and Jaime's own harrowing account, one of those construction barrels was out of place, sitting directly in her path. In a split second, the reality of the house met the reality of the road. A driver who is well rested and calm might have tapped the brakes or made a controlled maneuver. But Jaime was neither. She was jumpy, sleep-deprived, and mentally taxed by months of paranormal harassment. She overcorrected. The minivan, carrying her 3 children, clipped the embankment and began to flip. The physics of a rollover accident are violent and chaotic. The van rolled multiple times, glass shattering, metal groaning, and personal belongings flying through the cabin like shrapnel. When the vehicle finally came to rest, it was upside down. The silence that followed was the most terrifying sound Jaime had ever heard. She looked over to the passenger seat. Tori was gone. Jaime managed to crawl out of the wreckage, her body covered in cuts and bruises. She found Bridger and Jackson still buckled into their seats, hanging upside down, miraculously alive. But Tori was nowhere to be found. It wasn't until a witness ran toward the wreck, screaming, that the horror became clear. 13-year-old Tori had been ejected through the window during the roll, and the heavy minivan had landed directly on top of her. She was pinned beneath the weight of the steel frame. Emergency services arrived quickly. This was not a paranormal event. This was a matter of life and death in the physical world. The ground, however, provided a strange mercy. It had rained heavily for days before the crash, turning the Arkansas soil into a soft, muddy bed. As the van settled on Tori, she was pushed into the soft earth rather than being crushed against a hard surface. She suffered life-threatening injuries, including compression fractures in her back, but she survived. She spent 10 days in the hospital, including time in the ICU, fighting her way back from the brink. Now, we must analyze the why. Jaime is very clear in her testimony. She does not believe a ghost grabbed the steering wheel. She does not believe a demon pushed her off the road. But as an investigator, I see a direct link. The haunting was the contributing factor. It created an environment of extreme fatigue and psychological instability. The house didn't cause the wreck with a supernatural hand. It caused it by draining the life and focus out of the driver. It was a secondary kill, an indirect attack by an entity that had successfully weakened its prey. The day of the wreck, the activity in the house hit a peak. Neighbors reported seeing the shadow in the window at the exact time the van was flipping on the highway. Ben saw the tail end of a Victorian-style gown disappearing up the stairs. The smell of pipe smoke filled the kitchen. It was as if the house was celebrating the chaos it had helped orchestrate. Tori eventually came home from the hospital, but she returned to a house that was now hungry for more. The accident hadn't satisfied the spirits, it had emboldened them. The Sheas were no longer just a family living in a haunted house. They were survivors living in a war zone. And for Jaime, the realization was setting in. The house didn't just want their fear. It wanted their lives. The tragedy on the highway was a warning shot. And the next time, the soft Arkansas mud might not be there to save them. When logic fails and tragedy strikes, we look for experts who operate in the shadows. For the Shea family, that expert was the Central Arkansas Society for Paranormal Research, known as CASPER, led by investigator Karen Schillings and psychic medium Angela Lowe. This team didn't come with weapons, they came with recording devices, cameras, and a sensitivity to things the rest of us are trained to ignore. They arrived at the house in Lamar after Jaime wrote a local newspaper article detailing the family's ordeal. But even these seasoned investigators were not prepared for the density of the air inside that historic home. As a hunter of cases, I look for the moment an investigation shifts from observation to confrontation. That moment happened the second the Casper team stepped over the threshold. Angela and her daughter, Violet, who also possessed a spiritual sensitivity, immediately felt a crushing energy. They didn't see one ghost, they saw a crowd. Violet described it as a sea of people filling the hallways, particularly centered around Bridger's room, the room with the boarded-up fireplace and the name, Seth, spray painted in black. To get to the truth, the team decided to use a tool that many consider a gateway to something much darker, a spirit board. Or Ouija board. They needed a name. They needed a motive. They sat in the dim light of the house, fingers lightly touching the planchette, and asked the air, "Who is here?" The response was immediate and chilling. The planchette slid across the wood, letter by letter, spelling out, Seth. The family's suspicions were confirmed. The name under the pentagram wasn't just graffiti, it was an identity. But the next question changed everything. The investigators asked, "When were you alive?" The planchette moved to a single word, never. This is a critical distinction in any investigation. A ghost is a human who has passed away. An entity that has never been alive is something else entirely. It is what demonologists and paranormal investigators call an inhuman entity. It is a predator that has existed since before the house was built. Perhaps attached to the land or summoned by the rituals indicated by the pentagram and candles found earlier. Seth wasn't a boy who fell from a window. Seth was something that had likely watched that boy fall. The atmosphere in the house turned ice cold. The investigators reported that the malicious feeling became pressing. It wasn't just a presence anymore, it was an attack. The board began to move in a rapid figure-8 pattern, a sign of a high energy. Often negative entity trying to manifest. Then, the planchette pointed directly at the camera. Seth was letting them know he was aware of the observers. He wasn't hiding anymore. On the technical monitor, Alan Lowe, the team's specialist, captured something that still defies explanation. A tall, transparent figure began to form near the ceiling. It wasn't a smudge on the lens. It was a humanoid shape, defined and looming, that lingered for several seconds before dissolving back into the shadows. The house was no longer just a building, it was a living, breathing trap. The investigation reached its climax with a cleansing ritual. Angela and Violet used white sage, a Native American tradition intended to drive out negative energy and seal the rooms. They moved through the house, floor by floor, commanding the entities to leave. For a moment, it seemed to work. The air felt lighter. The oppressive weight that had nearly killed the family on the highway seemed to lift. The mediums reported that they had cleared dozens of spirits, ranging from harmless echoes of the past to the malicious force known as Seth. But as any investigator knows, a house with a history this deep doesn't give up its secrets easily. The team told Jaime that her home was one of the most active they had ever encountered. They had done what they could, but they left with a warning. Some things don't just leave because you ask them to. They wait, they hide in the walls, in the history of the soil, and in the boarded-up spaces where the light doesn't reach. The cleansing was a battle won, but the war for the Shea family's sanctuary was far from over. The investigators packed their gear and left, leaving the Shays alone once more in the silence of the Arkansas countryside. But the silence now felt different. It felt like a bated breath. It felt like something was standing just outside the circle of the sage's smoke, waiting for the embers to go cold. The cleansing ritual performed by the Casper team provided a temporary reprieve. But for the Shea family, the scars left by the house in Lamar were not just psychological, they were permanent. As an investigator, I have seen many families attempt to tough it out, to reclaim their investment and ignore the shadows. The Shays tried. They truly did. They stayed in that house for a few more months, hoping the peace would last. But the house had one final piece of evidence to present, a closing statement that would ensure they never felt safe within those walls again. It happened on a quiet evening, a night that felt deceptively normal. The family was gathered in the kitchen, trying to rebuild their sense of sanctuary. They were playing cards, the children's laughter filling the room, and a burnt CD was playing in the background. In 2003, these homemade discs were common, and this particular one had only about a dozen tracks of family favorite songs. Suddenly, the music stopped. The digital display on the player began to flicker and glitch, the numbers spinning wildly until it settled on a track that shouldn't have existed, track 99. Then, the voice came through the speakers. It wasn't music, it wasn't static, it was a repetitive, rhythmic chant, distorted by a digital rasp but unmistakably clear in its intent. You need to help, you need to help, you need to help, over and over. The voice skipped like a broken record, pleading or perhaps demanding assistance for a torment that had no end. They checked the disc later. There was no track 99. There were no such lyrics on any song they owned. That was the breaking point. The Sheas realized that you cannot negotiate with a location that consumes your peace. They packed what they could and left for good, eventually moving out of state to escape the heavy atmosphere of the Arkansas River Valley. As of 2025, Jaime Shea has not stayed silent. She has turned her trauma into a platform for others. Co-hosting a podcast titled The Unexplained Archives, she uses her experience to dive deep into paranormal conspiracies and lesser-known supernatural cases. Seeking the answers that the house in Lamar refused to give, she remains a credible witness to her own life, acknowledging that while the documentary A Haunting on the Discovery Channel brought her story to millions, it also embellished certain facts for TV drama. She is a woman who values the truth over the spectacle, standing by the reality that the most terrifying part of her story wasn't a phantom in the road, but the absolute exhaustion in the voice on track 99. Today, the house in Lamar still stands. It has seen other tenants come and go, its historic fireplaces still holding the etched dates of a century long past. But for the Sheas, the case is closed, even if the mystery remains. As an investigator, I've learned that some locations are like black holes. They pull in energy, history, and lives, leaving behind nothing but questions. The story of the Shea family serves as a chilling reminder that our homes are more than just wood and stone. They are vessels for everything that happened before we arrived. Sometimes, the past is content to stay buried. Other times, it demands to be heard, skipping the tracks of our lives until we have no choice but to listen. If you ever find yourself in an old, historic home and the air begins to feel heavy, if the lights flicker and the batteries drain for no reason, don't wait for a sign. Because by the time the house starts talking back, it might already be too late. I am your investigator, and this has been a deep dive into the Shea family haunting. Some fires never truly go out, and some whispers never stop calling for help. Thank you for watching Horror Stories. If you have the courage to hear more accounts of the unexplained, subscribe and join us in the dark. But remember, once you invite the story in, you can't always make it leave. Stay vigilant, stay safe, and never ignore the sounds from the upstairs floor.